All right, a fellow former journalist here with me, Alexandra Kitty, and you're an interesting type of journalist because you sort of are a journalist who studies journalists and have written a couple books, which I'll show people, not just a couple, several books, we'll show people in a second. Now kind of a media analyst, I guess, author. And what I really found interesting about your work, Alexandra, is that you have a background in psychology, which I also do. I have a master's of divinity degree with a specialization in psychology and counseling. And when you were on with Zuby and he asked you one of the biggest problems with modern day newsrooms, your answer was self-awareness. And I totally agree. I could not agree with you more. I say that all the time, that it just isn't something that is encouraged. It's not, and I feel like more and more what the focus is would be on the news, and it's just the speed at which it needs to be produced. That's and less right. On cultivating the person who's looking at the news or understanding the news, digesting the news, and then sourcing it out to other people. So I wanted to talk to you about that too. But maybe we just start with your background. Well, what got you into journalism? Why were you even interested in going into that profession?
I was a psychology student. I was studying experimental psychology with the idea of being a jury psychologist. My undergraduate thesis was in psychoacoustics, so I was as far away from journalism as you can imagine. And then the war in the former Yugoslavia broke out, and I didn't like the coverage because I had relatives on all sides of this conflict, and what I was getting was something totally different. So I started doing research, and I realized, well, bad information was going through, but how does this happen? So it dawned on me eventually, the way to find out was actually to be a journalist and to conduct empirical studies in the profession. So I was my own test subject. I was my own experimenter, and I would see what was the flow, what was the scaffolding of journalism, what could be improved. So I wasn't going in with thinking, okay, this is all bad. This should be all destroyed and taken down. It was, okay, there's something here that because of my psychology background, I could see. And how could I contribute to this profession? So that's how I started, just being curious, being upset, of course, but not being vindictive. So I had theories coming in. I took media sociology courses and stuff like that, even as a journalist. But I found that the theories weren't really aligned because the people who were making the theories weren't journalists themselves. So there was things missing even in that kind of study. So I said, well, if psychologists were studying things, but they weren't in the field, and people in the field you're wrapped up in the day-to-day problems you have to do. You don't always see things. So what if I go in fusing both psychology and journalism and see what I come up with? So that's how I started.
Where were some of the places that you worked?
I worked I had a column in the Hamilton Spectator. I did a column for a while for the Victoria Times Colonist. I started at the Burlington Post, which was a local paper. I moved up. I was a freelance writer for places such as that. I did stories for Editor and Publisher, Quill, Press Time, Maisonneuve, Elle Canada, and a few other places I can think off the top of my head. I did intern at Canada AM. I did all sorts of different things, and my beat was studying the business of journalism. So I was actually a journalist who was writing about journalism too. So I got as much over the years as I could. And when I had enough information, then I said, okay, let me see what this means. And then I left the profession and became an author.
When you left, did you feel like you were doing that because you genuinely just didn't want to be a journalist anymore and you wanted to write books? Or was that always your end game? Was always to sort of just leave at some point to get enough institutional knowledge and nuance about how the ecosystem works and leave? Or was there a reason specifically that you were like, I can't do this anymore?
I thought I should leave. You can go into it too long. When you're studying something, it's tempting to want to stay. So I said I had to have a line, whether I wanted to leave or not, because it's funny. I have people talk about my books and they'll still call me a journalist. I think that's, when you're a journalist, it's almost like being in the mafia. Once you're in there, you're always in there in some capacity, even emotionally. But I said, I have to go and look at what I have, because you can get on that treadmill way too long. And I said, I have to leave. For me to be able to maintain objectivity and see things as they are, I had to go.
Let's touch on what you were talking about related to self-awareness and just critical thinking. What's your read on why, I guess, those are such low value traits when hiring or even just employing, over time? It just doesn't seem to me like something, at least in my experience, that was cultivated. I mean, we would have these things called beat days at my last station, which we rarely had even at the other stations. Every once in a while we get them at my prior stations. But in Seattle, we would get maybe once a month, I'd get a beat day. And I would get a whole day to actually like make phone calls and read stuff one day. And then, the rest of the days I had 2 hours to get my stuff done, basically. I had a few hours to go do the interviews and everything, but to digest the material, I really didn't have that much time. 2 hours would be the amount of time I'd have to like write it, or log the video and sound, write it, edit it, because I did all that myself. There was just not a whole lot of time to, even if you were the most sane, critically thinking, smartest person, you arrived already with all of this background information, you'd have a very difficult time, at least working under the circumstances I worked in, and producing good material. But then throw somebody in who doesn't really have a whole lot of background on how the world works, thinks the government's here to help, thinks the world is orderly the way it is, and everything just kind of works out the way it should, and anyone who questions that is a conspiracy theorist, then you're really set up for problems. So I'm curious your thoughts on all of that.
Well, the people who own the media outlets usually were never journalists. And I found that when I was working, that was a big problem. When you don't understand the profession, you don't understand what it takes to be a reporter. When you're a journalist, you don't have time to reflect, which is absolutely critical. You can't reflect on how you feel on things, let alone how other people. So it's not like you have a profession where that couldn't do it. By the nature of this, false rush, you have to be the first to get. You have to do this, you have to do that. You're running on this hamster wheel. You don't even sometimes know how far you've gone away from what you need to do. And when there's so much antagonism, and when I did a lot of stories on business. So I was a business reporter. You're interviewing people in the C-suite who are never off. They're always selling. They're always saying that they're better than other people. So you might be feeling like you're on a pecking order. So the entire battleground, and that's what you are in the journalist. You are a soldier trying to find truths from this battlefield of lies. You're so focused on being the first or finding something, or if there's cutbacks, not losing your job, you don't have time to just pull back and say, wait a minute, this isn't working. You might have a suggestion, but management doesn't understand because they haven't gone through what you have gone as a journalist. It was a very fascinating and complex dynamic and play in this, and people need to catch their breath. If you can't sit back and pull back and think at the big picture, you might not notice when somebody's lying to you, or when, let's say, you're talking to a source that might actually be coming to you crying for help, and you don't even see it because you're so focused on absolutely everything that is detrimental for you to be able to do your job, where you at the end of the day go, yeah, I did my best, and I did it the way I wanted it to be done.
What do you think, in your experience in newsrooms, what do you think was the average level of awareness among people that they were regularly being sought out by special interests to be used as a mouthpiece for propaganda? Because I could just say for myself, it took me years. And by the time I finally realized there were these, sort of lions at the cage gate every day, waiting, chomping, sending us press releases, just wanted us to push whatever their particular agenda was. That was when I realized I couldn't stay anymore, because I just didn't have time to vet it. But I didn't realize that for many years, I'd never had managers that said in the morning meetings, all right, guys, remember, we got to be aware today of all the special interests that are trying to use us to push their agendas on the public. That just wasn't anything anybody was talking about. So what do you think? Were people mostly aware or not aware at all that they were being sought after?
You're not aware because, when people, public relations and the like, and other interests, they spend millions, if not billions of dollars researching how to get information through. When you go to J school, there's zero. You're not given that information. I knew because I was studying this as an outsider and then went in. But even then, a lot of times you had to sit back and think, okay, is this person playing me? Do they have a vested interest? I mean, you sometimes get attention that, seems very flattering, very positive. Well, that's the foot in the door technique. So when I was in psych, we would learn these things, and it was very interesting to see it actually happen to me. And a lot of times you just don't know what to look for. Sometimes people work by proxies. They will take somebody, you think somebody's speaking with a testimonial positive in defense of someone, and you don't know that this person was recruited by the crisis management team to to go to the press and tell them how wonderful this person is. They might have just called in a favor. So it's so complicated. Right. And you don't know from when you're beginning. And you have so many things on the ball. You're not just finding information in writing or producing stories. You have to find sources. You have to get reliable sources. You have to run here. You have to run there. And by the end of the day, it's absolutely exhausting. And you're always on the edge as a reporter. And that is probably one of the biggest hurdles to get over. You don't realize that you are just spinning in circles because you have to be first. And sometimes you're talking about an event that happened. There's catastrophic things. You're in the middle of war. You're dealing with a mass shooting. That gets to you too. So there's a toxic stew of things. And you're not given, let's say, a manual saying, okay, this is how we handle it. This is what you do when, somebody is trying to manipulate you. And here's somebody who's genuinely distressed and they've shut down and you have a deadline. How do you do something of use to this person while still holding on to your mandate? This is, complex. This is something in the sphere of psychology.
Thank you to everybody who goes and supports my sponsors, because you are directly supporting me and my ability to do this work, which allows me to be a full-time mom. And I can't thank you enough. It is the best Mother's Day gift that you could give me. You need a drink when watching today's news, especially if you're a mom who's raising kids in today's world. So go to AllisonWinePromo.com for that Mother's Day gift that the mom in your life can't get anywhere else. 50% off some of the best Malbecs in the world. These are from Argentina. 2 of them are extreme altitude Malbecs from almost 9,000 feet. One uses natural fermentation, one from the oldest vineyard in Argentina. Because of the extreme altitude location where the grapes grow, they're working a lot harder under the sun, just like mom. So what better gift for Mother's Day than AllisonWinePromo.com? Again, 50% off my favorite wines and 50% off shipping. But coffee may be more what your mom needs with what's going on in the world today. So go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, and get her some high altitude USDA certified Nicaraguan coffee. There's light roast, there's dark roast. There's a limited black edition, which is processed with honey. So a sweeter finish, not too sweet, just not bitter like some coffee aftertastes have. Also, there's a Caturra tea, which is tea made from coffee fruit. So if mom prefers tea, you can get her something like that. So let's continue on with the video. The awareness then of the other, I guess, if we were to call it that, when you're in a newsroom and somebody like you or somebody like me starts to say, guys, I think something's off here. So you're now you're like the other one. You're not on the team anymore. You're kind of seen as the outsider. I had different reactions. There were some people that were like, oh yeah, I mean, we're not able to do what we should be able to do, and you're starting to catch on. And then I had other people like managers who told me just basically never say that again in this newsroom. Like there were certain topics that were totally anathema. You couldn't question. Vaccines were one of them, which I didn't even know. This is like before COVID. I've told the story many times. I won't get into it right now, but just suffice to say that I didn't know that was a topic of real, just division and concern, and that if you were to even ask a question about it, about mandates or whatever, that there was a lot of pressure to stay silent. So when you become that person now that's starting to wake up, how do you find that person's treated by the newsroom when they start saying, I'm almost now starting to turn the journalism that I was trying to do on you guys. And I'm wondering what, you know what I mean, on my own newsroom. And I'm starting to wonder why we do things the way that we do. Is their feedback accepted and say, "Oh, thank you. This is great feedback. We'd love to help or have you help us change our operation so we can do a better job?" Or is it like, "Nah, it's time for this person to go be put on some kind of behind the scenes work?"
It happened to me because I'm a person who has no filter. So what happens is, because a lot of times outsiders attack journalists, it's almost like you have this bunker mentality, and then you have almost this sort of paranoia. So if somebody says something that goes against what everybody else has been saying, you are seen as the outsider and a troublemaker. You're not seen as, let's say, a organic and natural element of plurality. And that's also another problem. We talk in media about news pegs. So if other people are taking this topic with this angle, then other people do, and where people are afraid of being seen as wrong. And that's a default delusion. You could have two different conflicting answers, because one reality is this works for one group of people, but it's detrimental to another group of people. So we, look for a single story, and story involves narrative. So we're looking already to frame an issue that will preclude. And what's a story? You have a hero, you have a villain, you have a victim, all sorts of contrived and unrealistic roles. And if somebody doesn't fit, that's another concept we talk about in stories. If you're pitching a story, you've heard it doesn't fit with our editorial vision. And that's another problem. So you have these artificial sort of barriers that actually are just hypothetical constructs, or we can go and say they're just sanctioned insanity. We go with them because everybody else seems to go along with them. Mm-hmm. And then we mistake our construct for an absolute truth. So if you're somebody who comes in and you have a different perspective because your reality is that you grew up in a certain lifestyle or a certain set of circumstances, or you might have been a victim of a particular crime and nobody else in the newsroom was, it almost seems like it's like some sort of foreign monster. And instead of kind of going, okay, world is made of different people who have different wants and needs, it's almost rejected just because, well, it's something else. If you're overwhelmed, there's something called sensory overload. And that is what I found was very common among journalists. They were so burned out and didn't know it. That's why there would be a high reaction to different points of view. It's just overload, something else to have to remember, something else to do. So I don't think a lot of people, even in the profession, realize they've burned out, they've crashed, and their senses are overloaded. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think that was one of the most frustrating things for me during my tenure studying this, wasn't that I thought, oh, this is this. I thought there's burnout here, and there's overload, and there's so many simple ways to overcome it that we wouldn't have this kind of pressure cooker environment. It was totally unnecessary, and yet that's what people found themselves in, day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also sort of wonder about those of us who are attracted to the field to begin with, because I think some of us like that. I mean, for me, I had to just learn how to kind of enjoy a slow, quiet life because I was just so used to all that that stimulation. But I think the more I was still in that environment, in the newsroom environment, when I was getting to the point where I enjoyed hiking a lot more, I was spending a lot more time, in the mountains and backpacking and stuff. And I more and more did not like coming back to that world. But unless you somehow seek out those other experiences or you fall into them, if everybody around you is thinking this is all normal, like this is how everybody is. I know a lot of journalists think that they're going to hate life on the outside of the newsroom because of what you just described, because they're just going to be bored. They just feel like they're just going to be bored. And so there's almost like this withdrawal or addiction to the drama of it all and like being in the middle. And I don't know if that affects it too. I found this article, I don't know, a few months ago. I thought it was really interesting. It's from 2016, but it really did reflect a lot of what I what I saw too when I was in Seattle. And I'm sure it's not just Seattle, but the title is at Seattle TV stations, health news increasingly consists of PR for area hospitals. And they talk about, some of these programs are even paid programming. I mean, we had these partnerships like right here. They're talking about the Seattle Children's Hospital, but like actually Seattle Children's is who my station had a partnership with. And so, yeah, there's like paid programming. And even if it isn't paid programming, a lot of times, like they'll just send out a press release and we just go with it. We don't say, well, wait a second, is there research that, especially if it's a popular, which it usually is, because that's why the hospitals would put it out, right? Because they think it's going to give them good press, and people are going to like it. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of critical thinking about this, and not even just for the press releases, but like we had actual paid content. And sometimes, they would say like, this is sponsored by Seattle Children's, but you don't realize how deep those partnerships go too. And I know, talking to a reporter who quit not too long ago from same ownership company that I used to work for, they were having these partnerships during COVID with the government, going to vaccine clinics and doing all this stuff. And so there's all these things happening behind the scenes. And on the outside, the critics say, how is that happening? I mean, this is so nefarious. These people have to know what they're doing, that they're getting paid by hospitals and big pharma, or they're partnering with the government and they're pushing government propaganda. And I'm sitting here saying, no, they really don't. They think what they're doing. I mean, they know they're doing it, but they think it's for the good. I mean, they think what they're doing is they're partnering with these other public servants for the best interest of the community. They're not sitting there thinking, oh, we're really getting one over on the public. That's not how anyone I knew thought about it.
No, you don't think about it. I mean, it's something called cognitive dissonance. You have a certain set of beliefs, and then you're slowly kind of lured in to go against those beliefs. And so you start justifying it. And PR, and, as I said, journalism doesn't have, let's say, studies on how to counter it the way PR has studies and research and how to manipulate the public and how to get their message through. So that's a big problem. It's an unfair fight. So you're talking about people with certain resources going up against people who have vast, a war chest of that kind of psychological nudging and gaslighting. So that's a big problem. And a lot of times when J schools, they teach PR in the same places they teach journalism, and they're not one and the same. They're actually they contradict each other, and yet we have it under the same guise. And that's not what we should be seeing. We should see these as two separate schools. So we start from the first day of J school, where we have people teaching. I was getting my MA in journalism, and I was writing actually a very critical thesis on crisis communications, and my professor decided to team me up with somebody who was in PR as my advisor. So it starts from the beginning that you're not supposed to see that. Well, you don't see it because you take it as, a mundane reality, and you don't actually question how wise is it for us to have these two things together. And then you have PR firms coming in, and they're never off. They're always selling. You're always sell the reporter. And a lot of times you go, well, that would be a good idea. Hey, that's a good idea. You start justifying it. Even if it's a good idea, where did it come from? You have to question the provenance of information. And a lot of times you do that, and then people make you sound like you're the villain, and then you back off. It's a very predictable dynamic in play. And there are ways to counter it. But that takes a certain kind of training and a mindset where you're going in and you're going, okay, I don't want to be paranoid. And that's another thing. Sometimes you can go to the extreme and think everybody's trying to sell you something. So where's that balance? Where's that line? There's a whole bunch of things we could have, you can learn in J school. We don't learn them. You learn about the craft. You don't necessarily learn that actually you are a soldier in an intangible war. And that's, between finding truth and reality in a sea of narrative, atmosphere, and sophistry.
Yeah, and just even basic history lessons on how the government or other organizations have used the journalists over time to really not just affect history, but completely change the course of history in the benefit of one or another interest. And just hey, this happened, this could happen again. It's not like you're just living in some kind of vacuum where you're not going to be affected by the same problems. Okay, this is one of your newest books, Loaded Language and the Dilemma of Journalism. You also wrote Therapeutic Journalism, Presenting Information with Emotional Literacy. Big picture, what are these two books about?
Basically, it's actually, I would say, boiled down to a war manual for journalists. As I said, it would always bother me that you have PR, you have governments that spend billions of dollars. They have nudge units. They know how to play a public. They know how to use fear mongering. They know how the brain works. And this is a way for people in the profession or people who are interested in the profession to learn how to counter these strategies. So there's counter nudging, counter gaslighting, counter propaganda. So if you're given information, how to be able, even under stress and the tight deadline, to make room for you to think, okay, is this person using words such as loaded language to manipulate me? Am I getting how can I do data extraction from somebody's words? So what are they telling me? How can I know that I'm not being manipulated? And a lot of times you are being manipulated. So if the person has media training, if the person, we keep forgetting that people who were former intelligence officers had often go to Wall Street and they train people in the C-suite how to avoid interrogation, counter-interrogation techniques. Well, what do you do as a journalist if somebody has had that kind of military training? So this is an antidote to being able to find information in loaded language. We know that if you tell people how fast were cars going when they collide versus how fast are they going when they crash, they'll give you different speed estimates, even if they witnessed the same crash. We can implant false memories in people with as little as 45 words in narrative and a single photograph. So loaded language goes into the heart of that, while therapeutic journalism talks about how we have three filters working: an emotional lens, a primal lens, and an analytical lens, and how to use all three kinds of literacies to be able to vet information and to gather facts and be able to counter things such as gaslighting, nudging, and sophistry.
Okay, I'm going to take you over to my locals community where people put questions in ahead of time for interviews. So if you're watching this somewhere else, go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com. The first one is, does she have any ideas on how to fix the news media? And she does have plenty in her book, so go check that out. Anything else you'd like to elaborate on from the stuff you've talked about already?
Okay, so we are seeing the rise of independent and citizen journalism. So 2020 did something absolutely fantastic. It planted the new seeds of a new kind of journalism. So you're seeing a lot of independent people, former journalists, and people who were never journalists before, all of a sudden be able to become their own media outlet and often have bigger readerships and viewerships than traditional media. So we're not seeing we've seen the death of it, but we're seeing a resurrection in a completely different form. So more people now, when you go and you actually do research, independent research, and you do things such as have a stream or your own podcast, and you're doing things the way you know that this should be done. That's how journalism is going to be fixed. It's just not going to take the same form of legacy media. We're seeing now almost like passing of a torch to smaller outlets being a prime source of information, because people say, well, if you were in media and you were muzzled, you leave, you start your own media outlet. That is one of the most amazing things that I didn't think I was going to see when I started out in 1994. So we are seeing it. It's just not an overnight solution. And there's more than one way to fix the media. So we have to kind of get away from that single size, one size fits all, one rule that explains everything, and say, okay, let's see what journalism can do. We can have therapeutic journalism. We can have empirical journalism. So to see different kinds of reportage out there with different scaffoldings, different mandates. And we're starting to see that happen because it's not all housed under, let's say, a media monopoly. We're seeing a lot of now smaller players, independent people, going out and striking it down, and people want it. People want information. They want news. And another thing we should think about, we think so globally that we forget about the local news. That is probably, if you want to affect change, you start on the local level and build up. So it's not just the global, it's the local. And we're starting to see it. It's just, it takes time. Nothing happens overnight.
I totally agree that you can definitely have more of an effect on a local newsroom. And I think from the standpoint of people who are trying harder, who want to get it right, and I think they're just, I think in a lot of ways just not thinking about the stuff that we're talking about right now, but would perhaps be open to it. I think you'll find more of those in a local newsroom. Really, because they're closer to the source of information. The farther you get away, where you're either repeating wires or you're covering something that's on the other side of the country, it's far more likely you're going to get it wrong. You're going to be manipulated by some kind of special interest. And then, if you're the person actually going to the city council meetings on a regular basis, or you went to the scene of the fire or whatever it is, it's less likely that there's just fewer points of vulnerability along the information supply chain. So I agree with you on that one. Okay, it seems that the C in all major broadcasting networks has changed to censors or censoring or censorship, which more accurately reflects their news reporting intentions. And these are very creative. I suggest everybody go read the names here that Mike has made for all the different networks, but CNN, censoring news network or censoring news narrative. Let's talk about censorship for a second, though, because one of the things that I think I've noticed as well is that that when I first got into the field in, I guess 2007 was when I got my first job, to then when I quit in 2019, there was a very palpable difference in the way we saw silencing alternative voices or dissenters. And we felt much more free, or at least I should say I did. I felt much more encouraged and free at the beginning of my career to seek out that dissenting voice, versus at the end, it was like if we did that, we were platforming and we needed to shut them down instead of trying to figure out how to understand what they were thinking, or maybe did they make a valid point. We were going after it to expose and shut down. And I think this idea of again, endorsing because we're listening to you. The idea that association would mean endorsement of some kind was just very new. It wasn't something that I remember at the beginning. So then all of a sudden now you go from a journalist who's trying to understand better those voices that are not what the majority is saying, which is what journalism would be. Otherwise, if you were just pushing the majority, that's not journalism. I mean, any journalist, I feel like, would tell you that, right? But then when you put it into practice, but that's platforming, or that's endorsing, or we're giving credence to what they're saying. We have to shut them down. What do you think about that? What did you notice any changes in that regard? And what do you think about the role of journalism when it comes to, canceling, silencing, censoring, all that kind of stuff?
That's very abusive. I mean, that's a practice of cults. That's a practice of people who are domestic abusers. And we keep forgetting the most important thing, and what journalists should always remember, is we have emotional rights. You have the right, there's two rights you have when it comes to that: knowing reality as it is and being able to express what you see. So when people censor, what they're doing is being emotionally abusive, and they're violating people's emotional rights, A, and B, they're giving a false sense of reality. So that by censorship, that's a sin of omission. You're lying. So if you're lying and you're not exposing people to plurality, which is organic, people are going to come up with solutions that will not work. They will fail because they're not taking reality into account. They'll make things worse. They'll create antagonism. So people think that they have to fight people who don't agree with them, instead of thinking, okay, you go your way, I go mine, or maybe we negotiate, or maybe we just have to learn to look at each other's point of view and then come up with something that works for both of us, because we all live here. So when people start to censor, that's a sign of weakness. And that's actually a tacit admission that they're wrong, that they're lying, and that because they would know they're going to lose in a comparison. So when we have people willingly censoring, that we're having people who are basically abusing other people. So this is very abusive, and it's an emotional rights violation. And we have to think about it in those terms. Why are you afraid of somebody else's perspective? I know there are people who don't agree with me, and a lot of them have a good reason, but it doesn't mean that I'm wrong or I'm wrong or they're wrong. And neither one might be right. There's only one way to know, and follow the line of inquiry until we find a solution that is mutually beneficial. And that's what grown-ups do. And that's what healthy societies do. That's how we get innovation. That's how we solve problems. That's how we gain competence and we evolve.
I never heard anybody that I've interviewed call it a cult behavior, but I think that's spot on. I hope people that are still working in newsrooms are watching this video so they can bring that. Let us know in the comment section how your boss felt about that when you told him you feel like you work for a cult. Okay, I have a liberal friend in Canada who goes ballistic every time I bring up Candice Bergen. She claims the debates in Parliament are for show and that Trudeau does not need to answer questions from her, which he rarely does anyway, but spouts some party line that has close to zero relevance to the question asked. I think that's a ridiculous position to take. He is so very condescending in his disrespect of the MPs. What really bugged me was during the truckers' convoy, he told a member of the independent media to her face on camera that he refused to answer any questions put to him by her. She, a Rebel News reporter, Alexa Lavoie, was shot in the leg with a gas grenade and clubbed by cops at the protest a few days after her run-in with Trudeau. Is this how Canada treats the independent media all the time, or just due to the truckers' protests?
It's interesting. I mean, you have to kind of realize you have a prime minister that, has been given things. And, they cultivate, training. And then you have all these truckers come who have no media training, who don't have the privilege that he grew up with. And all of a sudden, the world absolutely adored them. And this was, some sort of rivalry. So there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that people don't know. So when we see, a leader not act like a leader and, abuse people, even if you don't think somebody who's asking you a question is a journalist, you still, if you are right, will answer the question. So what we're seeing here is people who know they're wrong, people who know they have an inferior perspective, who don't know what they're doing, trying to guess what a competent and leader would do, and just miss the mark time and again.
Okay, let's take a look at this. This was a kind of an anecdote, but brings up a good question. When I was a lad in the 1970s, I worked in a town daily newspaper. I learned to do every editorial job from darkroom to city editor, and a lot of non-editorial jobs like driving around, filling the sales boxes. In those days, there were no journalism majors on staff. Everyone came into it from somewhere else, some other job. And then starts to talk about how it changed. Now you're going to university, you get a journalism major, and they didn't learn a whole lot about some of the stuff we're talking about, or even practical things like how to cover a school board meeting. Anyway, he says, I think that's one problem with journalism today. None of them know a damn thing about anything. They've never really done anything else, and they have contempt for people not in their rare air. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, it is a problem. You have to work from the ground up, and a lot of people will turn up their nose, and they're afraid that they're not going to be able to do it. So this is a way of kind of hiding the fact that you're not self-confident. I do believe in journalism, you should take on a variety of roles. That's why I worked freelance when I was doing it, so that I wouldn't get a single perspective. How does it mean? What does it mean to be working in a local paper? What does it mean to be working in a national newsroom? So I would try to gain experience, do different things outside of journalism, so I could compare and contrast mindsets. So to gain competency, it does mean that you go around and you're almost like a Jack or Jill of all trades, and you try different things. So that's actually a very good point, because if you're doing different things, you're intermingling with different kinds of people. They give you information, they give you insight, and then when you're doing your job in journalism, you develop empathy. And the way we have set up the educational system in it, there is a complete lack of empathy. This is the point of view you take, that there is no debate. It's a very authoritative, patriarchal, one-size-fits-all point of view that doesn't work. So when you have to push something that doesn't work, you have to go through, bigger and bigger hoops. But if you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, take it back, ponder on it, add it to what you do as a journalist, you actually find that you have an expanded perspective rather than a confined perspective. So the more we confine a perspective, the more that perspective is incorrect. When you can take other considerations into your equations, you're a much better journalist. I find that empathy is something you need to actually go out and experience. So when you're seeing somebody who's about to be evicted, and you see somebody who, is living it up on the, and they're not struggling, you start seeing things. So I think that's a very good point, that journalists should go around and actually maybe even do some of the jobs they're covering so that they understand what it means to be, working in an Amazon warehouse versus working somewhere else. So that's a very valid point.
Interesting that you bring up that, empathy, because I think empathy also drives curiosity about another person's life and their decision making, their thoughts on things. And when it came to the COVID vaccines, for instance, and all the people that lost their jobs over those mandates, I was talking to a former coworker of mine who's still in the business. He's retired since, but he was in the business at the time. And he literally said to me, I have no sympathy for people who chose not to get the vaccine and then lose their jobs. And to me, that also says you might as well just say, I have no curiosity about why somebody would have made this life-altering decision. Why would they do this? Because if you say you have no empathy, basically you have no interest in trying to learn anything about them. For a journalist to just say that, like proudly, like, I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for you. Well, I hope you're not covering those stories then. I hope you're not put on this, which I'm sure he was. But I find that more and more, it's like, well, I have no sympathy for them. They're this or they're that. And so why would I even give them the time of day? And you're like, because that's your job. You know what I mean? It's like, your job is not making ice cream and then understanding people for fun on the side. Like, this is the whole reason you come to work. So if you have this emotional issue, this anger or disinterest or hatred or whatever it is, instead of looking at that as if you should be proud of that because you have the information that these idiots don't, you should look at yourself and say, that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing that I'm a journalist and I would say something like that. It's time for me to get out, which I guess he did because he retired. But, I think that that's just an embarrassing thing for somebody to say, but instead people are proud of it.
This is something I talk about in therapeutic journalism and loaded language to a different degree. What you're seeing, that is just analytical literacy. And analytical literacy is something very specific. So we have three literacies: the emotional, which weighs facts, not judges and weighs it; primal, that makes use of it to survive or thrive. But we also have analytical literacy, which is to gather facts. The worst thing that journalists ever did was to misconstrue a lack of emotionality with objectivity. This is the seeds of this profession's destruction. So we don't know how to deal with emotional literacy, so we take it out. What we have now are people who are analytical thinkers, wrote binary, 1 or 0, where 1 is everything and 0 is nothing. So you have now people who look at the world through such 1 and 0 scaffold and that they can't see anything. And that's not reality. We don't live in a binary world. We live in a pluralistic world. So when you have people with a lack of empathy, that's a red flag that they're not emotionally or primally in tune with their, with their surroundings. So that means that you can only see the world through 1/3 literacy, which means that there's no way you're going to ever find a right answer. So when we're starting to hear people talk about all or none, that's binary 1 and 0 thinking, where they see themselves as 1, and anybody who's even a little different is a 0. You can't be curious. You can't find information. You can't be helpful, and you can't have a good understanding of reality if you are only on 1 and 0 thinking.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Okay, is journalism yet another profession that has become ensnared by public relations, i.e., one runs across a lot of content that seems less interested in reporting facts and more interested in selling a point of view? And what are the main dangers of a majority of the news media being owned and controlled by 5 or 6 large corporations? I think we've talked a lot about number 1, but if you have anything else you want to add about that, go for it. But I think, yeah, that focus on monopolization of ownership, to me, I'll just give you my quick thought. I still think it doesn't solve the problem of the psyche of the journalists, like we've talked over and over. Because a lot of people say, well, what if you were to do public funding, for instance, instead of private funding? To me, I feel like you'd still have the same problems. I mean, if you change the system so that you didn't have this sausage factory where you're just churning out material constantly, like we talked about, the system itself is set up so that it promotes ignorance because you don't really have time for self-reflection anyway. So if you don't want to do self-reflection, or you're not in that mind space, then you don't have to worry about feeling bad about it, because you won't even know you missed out on it because you don't have time. But I don't think that the average person is like the average journalist would change, because, for instance, like I never had any experience with any reporter or manager coming into a meeting saying, hey guys, we're funded by big pharma, 70%. So we got to make sure we make big pharma look good today. It wasn't like they were aware of the connection between the funding and the manipulation and then their reporting. So I see them stuck in the same trap, even if there was less of that. But I'm not sure what you think about that.
Well, we see with monopolies that we're still having, declining circulations, news deserts, and dwindling circulation and the like. So big doesn't necessarily mean stronger. The problem is that a lot of times journalists feel like they're under the gun, they're under siege. So they actually see these people who are like big pharma, who are funding them, as almost like saviors. And then there's cultivating sort of this mindset of, manipulated gratitude. So that model, you get into unnatural habits, especially in a pub. When you say something in public, you tend not to want to walk back from it because you are under the mistaken impression you're going to lose face and people are going to see you as lesser. So that is a problem. So journalists are out there, they're getting attacked, and then they kind of, go into a little, they retreat, and then they look for any sort of sign of validation instead of saying, okay, this isn't working for me. This isn't working for our profession. You would have to kind of start again. And the people who always saw it, they're breaking away. They're starting their own media outlets. So what happens is you get actually, when you have this big mass of, corporate media, you're going to have more and more people say, you know what, I'm not there. I still want to inform people. I still want to be informed. I'm just going to go on my own. And that's where we're seeing, the brave people and the daring people, the innovators, the visionaries, go out on their own and strike out. And they're willing to go on the long haul. That's what's actually going to change the profession. The new generation coming in, that's who their role models will be. It's not going to be the one in the corporate media. It's going to be the one who's doing, a stream or a podcast or a Substack on the medium on their own.
What are your thoughts about Operation Mockingbird, which is basically the CIA infiltration of the media?
It's funny you should mention that. When I graduated from J school, I'm dating myself here, in 1996, that they did that was when they had the government, the federal government inquiry in the States over it. So I remember when I graduated, this was, front and center. And I'm not surprised, because journalism, journalism just has fiat. That's their currency, was people's faith in them. When that came out, when you have other sources coming in and, using that's when the first seeds of complete distrust, and people who were always distrustful, they had a reason to completely distrust the profession because of that. There's no place for that in journalism. Journalism has to constantly fight battles from all over. That's the nature of that beast. You, as I keep saying to people, when you're a journalist, you're a soldier. You have to see yourself as a soldier. You have to not be a Trojan horse. You can't allow yourself to be a proxy. You have people's trust, and trust and goodwill are very hard to come by. So when somebody takes advantage of it, they can have every good reason in the world. The bottom line is that there's a vulnerability in the system, and that exposed it. So to me, I found Operation Mockingbird to be utterly fascinating and very disheartening at the same time, because you had people, when they were reporters or columnists, they were justifying it. It's like there's no justification for it, because that you have credibility and goodwill. That's it. You lose that, nobody's going to believe you again. And we can see the alienation of people from the press because of it. And that was totally unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. That's all I got. Anything else? I really appreciate your taking the time. This is really therapeutic for me to go back to the name of one of your books. So I've learned a lot, and I'm glad to know that I'm not totally insane with some of the experiences that I've had. Any final closing thoughts, Alexandra, before you go, or where people should go to find you? I know you're on Twitter. I'll pull that up while you're talking.
Well, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Telegram. I have a YouTube channel. So there's ways to get in contact with me. But I would just say, for a lot of people who may be potential psychology students, if you think you don't know what you're want to do with yourself, there's journalism. Journalism and psychology go hand in hand. And it would be really nice to see, a lot more people who have that kind of background and be different kind of backgrounds to say, okay, I should, strike on my own. I should learn how to do this. It would be nice to see a new generation, want to understand other people who have empathy, you-centered emotional thinkers. They're made for journalism. People who can feel for other people. You're not being beguiled when you have empathy for others. When you give voices to people who have never had a voice before, there's something, quite, and, gratifying about that. So if we understand people and we take antagonism out and we learn to negotiate with each other, how much, we wouldn't be having economic depressions. We wouldn't be having the problems we had now if journalism was allowed to flourish the way it was always meant to.
Okay, Alexandra Kitty 1 on Twitter and also on YouTube, and you've got a bunch of books, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time.